A small roadside diner glowed warmly under the golden streetlights, its cozy atmosphere offering a haven from the biting chill of the night. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of freshly brewed coffee and sizzling bacon, mingling with the faint traces of worn leather and motor oil from the patrons who frequented the place. The soft murmur of conversations and the rhythmic clinking of cutlery created a soothing lullaby, punctuated only by the occasional chuckle from the corner booths or the melodic hum of an old jukebox playing a nostalgic tune from decades past. Leo sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, his rough hands wrapped around the warm ceramic mug. The grease stains on his knuckles told the story of a long, grueling day at the garage. He exhaled deeply, exhaustion weighing on him like an old friend. The diner was his refuge, a place where he could sit and exist without expectations, without noise. Across the room, Laura sat alone in a booth, her posture poised yet slightly weary. She had an air of quiet elegance about her, the kind that was effortless rather than forced. Her chestnut brown hair was neatly pulled into a loose bun, stray strands framing her delicate face. She had finished her meal, a modest plate of scrambled eggs and toast, but as she reached for her wallet, a flicker of panic crossed her face. Her fingers trembled slightly as she rummaged through her purse, checking every compartment, every pocket. It was gone. Her breath hitched, her stomach tightening. Where could it be? Had she left it at home? Had she dropped it somewhere between the car and the diner? Frustration swelled within her, mixing with a deep sense of embarrassment. She glanced around, her eyes darting to the waitress behind the counter, then to the few scattered customers in the diner. The thought of explaining her situation sent a wave of unease through her. Leo, sitting a few tables away, had been watching without meaning to. He noticed the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers moved faster with each passing second. He recognized that look, the quiet panic of someone realizing they were stuck in a situation they couldn't immediately fix. Without a word, he stood, reaching into his pocket for a few crumpled bills. "Put our meal on my tab," he said to the waitress, placing the money on the counter. His voice was steady, as if the gesture meant nothing at all. Then he returned to his seat, sipping his coffee as if nothing had happened. Laura blinked, stunned. It took her a moment to register what had just occurred. Slowly, she turned to face him. Hesitant yet grateful, she approached his table, her heels clicking softly against the worn linoleum floor. "That was very generous of you," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that matched the soft glow of the diner lights. "You didn't have to do that." Leo shrugged, barely looking up. "Everyone forgets their wallet sometimes." "No big deal." Laura studied him for a moment. There was something about him, something unassuming, something kind. "Still," she said, offering a small smile, "I appreciate it." She sat down across from him, surprising even herself. He raised an eyebrow but didn't protest. A comfortable silence stretched between them before she spoke again. "I'm Laura, Leo." He nodded. The conversation that followed was simple, effortless. They spoke of little things, the diner, the weather, the strange ability of old songs to bring back memories. Yet, there was something lingering beneath their words. An unspoken understanding between two strangers who had somehow stumbled into each other's path. Just as the moment began to settle into something almost comfortable, the door to the diner swung open with a jingle of bells. The cold wind rushed in, carrying with it a figure dressed in dark, tattered clothing. His eyes were sharp, darting around the diner like a predator assessing his surroundings. Leo stiffened instinctively. Something about the man put him on edge. He wasn't just a late-night customer looking for a meal. There was a tension in his stance, an urgency in the way he moved. Laura noticed it too. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table as the man walked toward the counter, his hands slipping into the pocket of his jacket. Then it happened. A flash of metal, a sharp inhale from the waitress, the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Empty the register," the man growled, his voice rough and jagged like broken glass. The diner fell into a suffocating silence. The waitress, a young woman barely in her 20s, swallowed hard, her hands trembling as she reached for the cash drawer. Leo's jaw clenched. He glanced at Laura, noting the way she had frozen in place, her breath shallow. He had been in enough rough situations to know when things could turn bad quickly. The waitress fumbled with the register, her fingers moving clumsily. The man snarled, stepping closer. Faster, he barked. Something inside Leo snapped. He pushed back his chair, standing slowly. Hey, he said, his voice calm but firm. Take it easy. No one wants trouble. The man's gaze snapped to him, eyes narrowing. Sit down, he spat. Leo didn't move. He wasn't reckless, but he also wasn't the type to watch innocent people get hurt. He took a careful step forward, keeping his hands visible. Listen, he continued, keeping his voice level. You don't want to do this. It's late. You're tired. You don't need this kind of trouble. For a moment, something flickered in the man's eyes, doubt, hesitation. But it vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. His grip on the gun tightened. Back off, he warned, his hand shaking slightly. Laura, heart hammering in her chest, suddenly found her voice. Please, she said softly, stepping beside Leo. You don't have to do this. Whatever's going on, there's another way. The man's expression wavered. His fingers twitched. Then, as if the weight of the world had crashed down on him all at once, his shoulders slumed. A long breath escaped his lips, and he slowly lowered the gun. The tension in the room broke like a snapped wire. The waitress let out a strangled sob, her hands still clutching the edge of the counter. Leo didn't move, watching carefully as the man placed the gun on the counter, his face a mixture of exhaustion and regret. I'm sorry, the man whispered, his voice cracking. Leo nodded. It's not too late to fix things. The distant wail of sirens broke the silence. Someone had called the police. The man glanced toward the door, but didn't run. He simply stood there, as if finally realizing the depth of what he had almost done. When the officers arrived, Leo and Laura watched in silence as the man was taken away. As the diner slowly returned to life, Laura turned to Leo, her eyes filled with something unwritable. You didn't have to do that, she murmured. He gave her a small, tired smile. Everyone needs a little help sometimes. Laura studied him for a long moment before nodding. She knew she would never forget this night, nor the man who had quietly stepped in when it mattered the most. And as they sat back down, the jukebox hummed another song, as if the world had started turning again. A few days later, fate played its hand again. Laura stepped into the dimly lit diner, the familiar scent of coffee and freshly baked pastries wrapping around her like a warm embrace. The place had an undeniable charm, cozy, welcoming, and untouched by the chaos of the outside world. She craved that comfort more than she cared to admit. As she settled into a seat near the window, her gaze wandered across the room. That's when she saw him. Leo was already there, a plate of fries in front of him, absent-mindedly twirling one between his fingers as he stared out the window. His expression was unreadable, but when their eyes met, recognition flickered in his gaze. A slow, amused smirk crept onto his lips. You again, he said, leaning back in his seat. Laura couldn't help but smile. Guess this place has good food. Or maybe we're just creatures of habit. He gestured to the seat across from him, silently inviting her to join him. She hesitated only for a second before sliding into the booth. Something about Leo intrigued her. He was different from the people in her world, refreshingly real, grounded. She wanted to know more about him. Their conversation started off light, filled with harmless jokes and casual observations, but soon it deepened. Leo spoke about his dream of owning a garage, his love for fixing cars, and the struggle of making ends meet. There was no self-pity in his voice, only determination. Laura listened, captivated by his passion. I've always loved cars, he admitted, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. Engines, parts, the way everything fits together, it just makes sense. Unlike life, which is a whole mess of unpredictable twists. She chuckled. I know the feeling. What about you? He asked, looking at her intently. What's your dream? Laura hesitated. She had spent so long living behind the image of a powerful CEO that she had forgotten what it felt like to just be Laura. She wasn't ready to reveal her true identity. Not yet. I love traveling, she said instead. Seeing new places, meeting people, learning about different cultures. He raised an eyebrow. Sounds expensive. She laughed, not confirming or denying. It has its perks. Leo nodded, sensing there was more to her story than she was letting on. But he didn't push. Instead, he picked up a fry and offered it to her. Try this. It's the best thing on the menu. She accepted it with a smile, and just like that, an unspoken bond began to form between them. Days turned into weeks, and their meetings became intentional. Laura found herself drawn to the small auto shop where Leo worked. She would bring him coffee, watching as he expertly worked on engines, his hands moving with precision and passion. There was something fascinating about the way he poured himself into his work, lost in the rhythm of it all. One afternoon, she leaned against the hood of a car, sipping her drink as she observed him. "You really love this, don't you?" Leo glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, it's the one thing in my life that makes sense." She tilted her head. "Why haven't you opened your own garage yet?" He let out a dry laugh. "Because dreams require money, and I barely make enough to keep the lights on." Laura's heart clenched. She had more than enough money to make his dream a reality. She could write a check right now, but she knew he'd never accept it. He was too proud, too independent. Instead, she said, "You will, someday." He studied her for a moment before nodding. "Yeah, someday." One evening, as Laura walked to her car, she noticed Leo standing outside the shop, staring at something in his hand. His expression was dark, troubled. She approached cautiously. "Everything okay?" Leo didn't look up. He clenched his jaw, exhaling sharply before shoving the paper into his pocket. "Yeah, just some unexpected news." She frowned. "You sure?" He forced a smirk. "What, worried about me?" She crossed her arms. "Maybe." For a moment his tough exterior cracked, and she caught a glimpse of something raw beneath the surface. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "My landlord's raising the rent. If I don't come up with the extra cash, I'm out." Laura's stomach twisted. "That's life," he interrupted, forcing a smile. "I'll figure it out." She wanted to help, but she knew offering money would only push him away. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope. "Here." He eyed it suspiciously. "What's this?" "A gift card to this diner." She smiled. "At least I know you won't starve." Leo stared at her for a long moment before taking it. His fingers brushed against hers, sending a small jolt through her. "Thanks, Laura." She nodded. But as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that Leo was drowning, and she didn't know how to save him without breaking the fragile trust they had built. A week later, things took a turn for the worse. Laura arrived at the shop to find it eerily silent. No sound of tools clanking, no radio playing in the background. Her heart pounded as she stepped inside. Leo, he was sitting on the floor, his back against the counter, a defeated look on his face. A crumpled eviction notice lay beside him, her breath caught. Leo looked up, his eyes tired, empty. "Game over, Laura. They're shutting me down." She knelt beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "You can fight this." He let out a hollow laugh. "With what?" "Hope. That doesn't pay the bills." For the first time since she met him, she saw the weight of his struggles pressing down on him. He had fought for so long, but even the strongest people had breaking points. She took a deep breath, making a decision she knew could change everything. "Leo, I have something to tell you." He looked at her, confused. "What?" She hesitated for only a second before saying, "I'm not just a traveler. I run a company, a big one." His brows furrowed. "What are you saying?" "I can help you." He stiffened, his jaw tightening. "No, Leo, no, Laura." He stood up, shaking his head. "I don't need charity." She rose to her feet, her voice firm. "It's not charity, it's belief in you." He stared at her, struggling with his pride, his frustration, and something else, something vulnerable. Silence stretched between them before he finally exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "And what do you get out of this?" She met his gaze. "A chance to see you win." His lips parted slightly, as if the words had hit him harder than he expected. For the first time in a long while, hope flickered in his eyes. And just like that, everything changed. One evening, as they sat by the diner window, Laura's phone rang. She hesitated before answering, her fingers tightening around the device as if contemplating whether to reject the call. Leo, seated across from her, sipped his coffee and gazed out at the city lights beyond the rain-streaked glass. The atmosphere was cozy, warm, familiar, until the words that followed shattered it all. "The merger is almost finalized. We'll be signing the deal for $200 million by next week." Leo froze mid-sip. The words echoed in his mind, crashing into him like a tidal wave. He slowly set his cup down, his eyes locking onto Laura's. She noticed the change in his expression, how his usual warmth had turned to ice, how suspicion flickered through his gaze like a flame. Hurriedly, she ended the call, stuffing her phone into her purse as if that could erase what he had just heard. "Leo, let me explain," she began, her voice laced with urgency. but he raised a hand, silencing her. His heart pounded. "Who are you, Laura?" His voice was quiet, measured, but filled with a restrained intensity that made her chest tighten. "You've been hiding this from me the whole time?" Laura swallowed, looking down for a moment before meeting his eyes again. There was regret in them, a sadness that didn't belong to a woman about to close a $200 million deal. "I didn't want you to see me differently," she admitted. "I wanted you to know me for who I am, not for what I have." A bitter chuckle escaped Leo's lips. He leaned back, shaking his head. "You think I care about your money?" He exhaled sharply, frustration evident in the way his fingers drummed against the table. "It's not about that. It's about trust. If you couldn't be honest with me about something this big, what else are you hiding?" She reached out for his hand, but he pulled away. The rejection stunned more than she expected. "Leo, please," she whispered, desperation creeping into her voice. "It was never my intention to deceive you. I didn't know how to tell you. How about the truth?" His voice cracked slightly, betraying the pain he was trying to suppress. "From the beginning?" Laura exhaled, her hands clasped together as if trying to hold herself steady. "I was going to tell you," she admitted, "but every time I tried, I was afraid. Afraid that the moment you knew, things would change between us." Leo scoffed. "Things are changing now, aren't they?" He gestured around them. "Because now, I don't even know who I've been dating for the past year. Was it Laura, the woman I fell in love with? Or Laura, the business tycoon who keeps $200 million secrets?" His words hit her harder than she expected. She bit her lip, forcing back the sting of tears. "I am still me, Leo," she insisted. "The woman who loves reading on rainy Sundays. The one who laughs at your terrible jokes. The one who But you're also the woman who lied to me." He interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made her chest ache. "And that's not something I can just overlook." The silence between them grew thick, suffocating. Outside, the rain intensified, droplets racing down the window pane like tears neither of them wanted to shed. Laura's heart clenched as she watched Leo's expression harden. She could see it, he was slipping away. "Leo," she tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, don't walk away like this." He hesitated. For a brief moment she thought he might stay, that he might give her the chance to explain, to make things right. But then he stood up, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape against the floor. "I need time," he said, "to think, to process." He glanced at her one last time, and the pain in his eyes was undeniable. "I just don't know if I can trust you again, Laura." And with that, he turned and walked out, leaving her sitting there, heartbroken and alone. Laura sat frozen for what felt like hours. The coffee in front of her had long gone cold, much like the warmth between her and Leo. Her fingers trembled as she reached for her phone, considering calling him, explaining everything in a way that would make him understand. But she stopped herself. Would it even make a difference now? The truth was, she had been scared. Scared that if he knew who she really was, he would never see her the same way. And now, ironically, she had lost him anyway. A lump formed in her throat as she stared at her reflection in the window. Who was she without him? A woman who had built an empire, yes, but also a woman who had just watched the man she loved walk away because of her own choices. Her phone vibrated, snapping her out of her daze. For a split second, she hoped it was Leo. But it wasn't. "Mr. Callahan wants to move the signing date up," the message read. "Are you available tomorrow?" Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Business had always been her safe space, a world where emotions were secondary to logic and strategy. But now, sitting in that empty diner, she wasn't so sure if success meant anything without someone to share it with. She sighed, finally typing out a reply. "Yes, confirm the details." As she sent the message, she made a silent promise to herself. If she ever got the chance to fix things with Leo, she wouldn't hold back. She would tell him everything. Because love, real love, deserved honesty, even if it scared her. Days passed, but the weight of their last conversation lingered heavily on both Leo and Laura. No matter how much they tried to move on, the echoes of their words clung to them like a ghost refusing to be laid to rest. Leo buried himself in work, but his mind wasn't in it. His hands moved on autopilot, tightening bolts, checking systems, making adjustments, but his thoughts drifted elsewhere. He missed Laura's presence, her laughter, her quiet understanding, the way she listened to him like he mattered. His chest ached with longing, but just beneath that longing was a wound still raw and bleeding. "You love her, don't you?" Leo flinched. His friend Marco leaned against the tool bench, arms crossed, watching him with knowing eyes. "I don't know if I can trust her again," Leo muttered, sighing as he tightened a bolt for the third time. Marco raised an eyebrow. "People make mistakes. What matters is if they're willing to fix them." Leo's jaw tightened. He wanted to believe that. God, he wanted to believe that more than anything. But the betrayal still burned, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Laura's face, not the woman he had fallen in love with, but the woman who had kept a secret from him, the one who had let him believe a lie for so long. Meanwhile, Laura sat in her office, staring at the city skyline. The usual satisfaction she got from closing deals and making bold business moves was absent. Her victories felt hollow, her success an empty shell without Leo. She wanted to call him. She had drafted texts, written emails, even dialed his number a few times before hanging up, afraid of what she might hear. Would he even pick up? Would he let her explain? Or worse, would he just tell her he had moved on? A knock at the door startled her. It was Sophie, her assistant, holding a folder. But the concern in her eyes told Laura that she saw more than just another late-night work session. "Laura, you should go home," Sophie said gently. "You've been staring at that window for hours." Laura forced a smile. "Just thinking." Sophie hesitated. "About him?" Laura looked away, her throat tightening. "It doesn't matter. He probably hates me now." Sophie placed the folder on the desk and sat across from her. "You'll never know unless you talk to him." "I'm afraid," Laura admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afraid he won't forgive me. Afraid I already lost him." "Then fight for him," Sophie said simply. "If you love him, don't let fear make the choice for you." That night, Laura found herself outside Leo's apartment. She had rehearsed what she would say, planned out every word, but standing there now, her heart pounded so loudly she could barely think. Taking a deep breath, she knocked. Leo opened the door, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The sight of him stole her breath. He looked tired, like he hadn't been sleeping well. And yet, there was something in his eyes, something she couldn't quite name. "Laura," he said, his voice guarded. "Can I come in?" she asked hesitantly. He hesitated, then stepped aside. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with pain, with longing. She took a deep breath and turned to face him once the door was closed. "I know I hurt you," she started. "And I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I need you to understand why I did what I did." Leo crossed his arms. "Then explain." Laura swallowed hard. "I was scared. I thought if I told you the truth I'd lose you. And I know that keeping secrets was wrong, but I never meant to hurt you." Leo's eyes darkened. "But you did, Laura. You didn't trust me enough to be honest. And now I don't know if I can trust you either." Tears pricked her eyes, but she held them back. "I love you, Leo. I love you enough to admit I made a mistake, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that to you." For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, Laura. I don't know if love is enough." Her heart clenched. "Then tell me what is. Tell me how to fix this." Leo looked at her, his expression torn. "I don't know yet." Laura nodded slowly, the weight of his words settling deep in her chest. "Then I'll wait. No matter how long it takes, I'll wait." He didn't respond, but he didn't ask her to leave either. And for now, that was enough. Because sometimes love wasn't about immediate forgiveness. Sometimes love was about fighting, about proving, about holding on when everything else was telling you to let go. Leo stood outside the small-town diner, the neon lights flickering in the dusk like distant stars. His heart pounded against his ribs, the cold evening air doing nothing to calm the storm inside him. He had spent days wrestling with his emotions, trying to make sense of the betrayal he had felt. But now, standing here, he realized what he had truly felt was not betrayal, it was hurt. Hurt that Laura hadn't trusted him enough to tell him the truth. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the glass door. The familiar jingle of the bell echoed through the diner, but to Leo it felt like the chime of fate. His eyes scanned the room, heart hammering in his chest. And then, he saw her. Laura sat in their usual booth, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring blankly at the window. The golden light from the street lamp outside cast a glow on her delicate features. As if sensing his presence, she slowly looked up. Their eyes met, and in that single moment, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them: pain, regret, hope. Leo stepped forward. Laura's fingers tightened around the mug as he slid into the seat across from her. "I didn't think you'd come," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Leo let out a slow breath, his fingers tracing the rim of the salt shaker. "Neither did I." Silence stretched between them, thick with everything left unsaid. Finally, Leo spoke, his voice raw. "I was angry." Laura flinched, bracing herself. "I know. Not because you're rich," he paused, looking straight into her eyes, "but because you didn't trust me enough to tell me." Her lips trembled, and she lowered her gaze to the table. "I was afraid." Her voice broke. "I've seen how people change when they find out. The way their eyes light up, the way they suddenly act like they know me when they never cared before. I didn't want to lose you, Leo. You were different." Leo clenched his jaw. "Then why did you keep it from me?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because I was terrified you wouldn't be." He exhaled sharply, leaning back. He understood now. She hadn't hidden it to deceive him, she had hidden it out of fear. Fear that he would see her as someone else, that his feelings would change. And the truth was, if she had told him earlier, it wouldn't have mattered. What had hurt was the secret itself. "I don't care about your money, Laura," he said finally, voice firm. "I care about you." She blinked up at him, her tears shimmering in the dim light. "You mean that?" He nodded. Every word. A slow, trembling smile spread across her lips. "Then let's start over." Leo reached across the table, taking her hand in his. He felt her fingers, small and cold, curl around his own. He squeezed gently. "No more secrets?" "No more secrets," she whispered, and in that moment something heavy lifted between them. But just as they were about to settle into their newfound understanding, the door swung open with force, and a tall figure stepped inside. Leo turned instinctively, his stomach twisting as he recognized the man. James Sterling. Laura stiffened, her grip on Leo's hand tightening. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice laced with tension. James smirked, his sharp suit a stark contrast to the homely feel of the diner. "Checking in on you, little cousin. Imagine my surprise when I heard you'd been spending time with someone interesting." Leo's fingers curled into a fist. He had heard of James, Laura's cousin, the heir to the family business, and a man known for his ruthlessness. Laura stood up, her voice firm. "You don't get to interfere in my life, James." James raised an eyebrow, shifting his gaze to Leo. "I'm just making sure you're making wise choices. Our family has a reputation to maintain, and we can't have you getting distracted." Leo stood up slowly, his body tense. "She's not a business deal, James." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Maybe not, but she is part of a legacy. And you, well," he trailed off, his smirk deepening. "You don't fit the picture, do you?" Laura stepped between them. "Enough." Her voice was steel. "I don't care what you think, James. Leo is with me, and if you can't respect that, you can leave." James' expression hardened, but after a moment he scoffed. "Fine. Have it your way." He turned, but before walking out, he threw one last glance at Leo. "Just remember, this world isn't as simple as you think." The door swung shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Leo turned to Laura. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though she looked shaken. "I knew he'd show up eventually." Leo frowned. "What does he mean by this world?" Laura hesitated before exhaling. "My family, they're not just wealthy, Leo. They're powerful, and they like control. James especially." Leo studied her. "And you? Do they control you?" Laura lifted her chin. "Not anymore." Leo searched her face, then reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "We'll figure it out, together." A tear slipped down her cheek, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was relief. She leaned into his touch, nodding. "Together." The weight of the past days lifted, and as Leo pulled her into a gentle embrace, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what came next, he wasn't going anywhere. Leo had always been a dreamer. From the time he was a teenager, he envisioned owning a garage, a place where he could pour his passion into fixing cars and crafting machines that roared with life. It wasn't just about repairing engines, it was about creating something with his own two hands. Proving to himself and the world that he was capable. But dreams, he knew, didn't come easy. Months of tireless work, sweat, and sacrifice had finally led him to this moment. The garage was his. It stood proudly on the corner of a quiet street, a humble yet sturdy place where the scent of grease and metal mixed with fresh possibilities. Leo ran his fingers along the sign above the entrance, Leo's Auto Repairs, and a slow, proud smile spread across his face. Laura had been there through it all. His steady anchor in the storms, the quiet encouragement in his hardest moments. She had offered to help financially, but Leo had refused. Not because of pride, but because he wanted to know he had built this with his own effort. He wanted to prove, especially to himself, that he was worthy of his own dreams. One bright morning, as Leo tightened the last bolt under a dusty old Chevrolet, the familiar sound of footsteps approached. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Laura had a way of making her presence known, even in silence. "Busy?" she teased, her voice carrying a playful lilt. Leo wiped his hands on a rag, then turned to face her. She stood there, radiant as always, holding 2 cups of coffee. The sight made something in his chest tighten, nostalgia, affection, maybe even relief. "Never too busy for you," he said, taking the cup from her hand. Their fingers brushed for a moment, sending a quiet current between them. Laura took a sip of her coffee before setting it down on the hood of the car. With a slow, deliberate motion, she reached out and placed her free hand on top of his. A glint of light caught his eye. That was when he saw it, a ring. Leo stilled. His breath hitched in his throat as he stared at the delicate band wrapped around her finger. His heart thudded, a mix of surprise, joy, and something else, something unspoken. He smirked, trying to steady the sudden whirlwind inside him. "Fiancé suits you." Laura chuckled, though her eyes gleamed with something deeper. "And you, Mr. Mechanic, are officially stuck with me." They clinked their coffee cups together, but Leo could sense there was more beneath Laura's usual lightheartedness. He knew her too well. He could read her like the pages of a book he had memorized over years of late-night conversations, stolen glances, and moments where words weren't necessary. "You're quiet," he observed, tilting his head. "Something on your mind?" Laura hesitated, then sighed. "There's something I need to tell you." A sliver of unease crept down Leo's spine. "Okay, tell me." She looked away for a moment, as if choosing her words carefully. When she met his gaze again, her expression was serious. "Do you remember my brother, Ethan?" Leo stiffened. How could he forget? Ethan had never approved of him. He was the kind of man who saw life in terms of money, status, and success. To him, Leo was just a mechanic, a man with a dream but no real security. And for someone like Ethan, that was enough reason to dislike him. "Yeah," Leo said cautiously. "What about him?" Laura bit her lip before speaking. "He knows about us, about the engagement." Leo exhaled slowly. "I figured that was coming sooner or later. He wants to meet you." That made Leo pause. Of all the things he had expected, that wasn't one of them. "Meet me?" he repeated. "Why?" "He says he wants to talk face to face." Leo narrowed his eyes. "Laura, is this some kind of test? Because if he's just going to sit me down and tell me how I'm not good enough for you, I don't have time for that." Laura reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "It's not a test. It's just, you know how he is. He wants to make sure I'm making the right choice." Leo let out a small chuckle, though there was little humor in it. "And what does he think the right choice is?" Laura shook her head. "It doesn't matter what he thinks. What matters is us." Leo studied her for a long moment. Then with a sigh, he nodded. "All right, I'll meet him." The next evening, Leo walked into a quiet cafe where Laura had set up the meeting. He spotted Ethan immediately dressed in an expensive suit, sipping a black coffee, his expression unreadable. Leo took a deep breath and walked over. "Ethan." Ethan looked up, nodding slightly. "Leo." "Sit." Leo did, keeping his posture relaxed, though his mind was already running through the possible outcomes of this conversation. Ethan leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "I won't waste your time. You and Laura are engaged now. That means you're serious." Leo met his gaze evenly. "I've always been serious about her." Ethan studied him for a long moment. "You know why I've had my doubts?" Leo smirked. "Because I don't come from money?" Ethan didn't deny it. Laura deserves security, stability, and I wasn't sure you could give her that. Leo felt a flicker of irritation, but he kept his voice even. "I get it. You're her brother. You want the best for her. But let me be clear, I may not be rich, but I'm building something, and I will always take care of her." Ethan was silent for a moment, then sighed. "Laura believes in you. That's enough for me." Leo blinked. "That's it?" Ethan smirked slightly. "You were expecting a fight?" Leo shrugged. "Something like that." Ethan leaned back. "I don't trust them easily. But if Laura's chosen you, I'll respect that. Just don't prove me right. Leo nodded. I won't. As Leo left the cafe, the weight that had been pressing on his chest lifted. When he reached the garage, Laura was already waiting for him. How did it go? She asked anxiously. Leo wrapped his arms around her, pressing a kiss to her forehead. He gave his blessing. More or less. Laura laughed softly, relief washing over her features. I told you he'd come around. Leo smirked. You did. And you were right. She looped her arms around his neck. You really love me, don't you? Leo cupped her face. His voice soft but firm. More than anything, she smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. Good, because you're stuck with me now. He kissed her then, sealing not just a promise, but a future. One built on love, determination, and the unwavering belief that together they could weather any storm.